Good afternoon. This is CIVE633, Environmental Hydrology, Fall 2021, here at San Diego State, Department of Civil Engineering, Civil, Environmental, and Construction Engineering. And the subject today is a paper that I wrote about 5 or 6 years ago, which I call the paper Ecohydroclimatological Research, the case for geomorphology. We believe that geomorphology is the key. Learning or understanding geomorphology is the key to tying together all the other sciences that we have mentioned. We did begin the coverage of this paper last Thursday, but we did only about 5%. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to continue where I left. First, I'm going to share the screen. Let me see what I get in here. Can everybody see the green screen? Green screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. The first question that we pose ourselves today is how smooth is the Earth? In terms of geomorphology, we should know that. In the past, I used to ask my students in my classes, in my hydrology classes, I used to teach hydrology many years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. I asked them, what do you guys think? Is the Earth as smooth as a ping pong ball, or is it as smooth as an orange? And half of the students said ping pong ball, and half of the students said orange. The answer is ping pong ball. The Earth is very, very smooth. And I've done a calculation here to show the roughness of the Earth in this equation that I'm showing here, equation 1. I think this is very few equations in this paper. That's why it's so readable. I took the height of the Everest, converted it to meters, 8,848 meters, kilometers. 8,048 meters converted to, what is this over here? Yeah, I'm not quite sure what we did in here. At any rate, let me review this later. I think there's a mistake in there. How funny. I reviewed this morning. And at any rate, the smoothness of the Earth is very small. If we see the Earth, and we many times have done through the satellites and so forth, if we see the Earth, we can see that it is extremely smooth. So therefore, and the reason for that is, it will be explained a little bit later. The reason is that the elevations, which is like in the case of the Everest, is 8,000 meters, compared to the diameter or the quadrant of the Earth is very small. The Earth is, the circumference of the Earth is 40,000 kilometers. So each quadrant, each 1/4 of it is 10,000 kilometers, which would be around 6,000 miles. So the Earth is, the conclusion is the Earth is very smooth when seen from above, even though if we wanted to climb the Everest, we will have a hard time. And I show here a picture of Everest Mountain for you to see. I pulled this out of the web. I wasn't there. I have not been to the Everest. I was in Nepal, but never reached the Everest. I actually was in India and just crossed over to Nepal, but the Everest is up north of Nepal, so I never got there. Okay, that is a lot of roughness out there. On the other hand, on the other extreme, we have situations like the Unisa Flat in Bolivia, where we have a very large saline lake, which is encompasses 10,000 square kilometers and is extremely flat. People that have studied this say that there's barely a difference of 1 meter between one point and the other. The total elevation difference in the Salar de Uyuni or Unisa Flat is 1 meter. In the United States, we have Bonneville Flats in Utah, northwestern side of the state of Utah, which is kind of the same as this, but is a lot smaller. I'm not sure the numbers, but I would say at least this is 10 times, at least 10 times greater than the Bonneville Flats. Now, the question, of course, is for us, from the standpoint of understanding, how is it that this was formed and why here? So I'll get to that later on. I've written a couple of papers on this subject, and we'll get there. Interestingly, though, I want to show you this picture, which is actually a fascinating picture. We don't know exactly what this is. What does it look? And the reason why we don't see it is because we can't figure it out. Is because it is deformed. But if I click on the image to show the true aspect, that is the true aspect of this picture. Exactly how it was taken, I honestly couldn't tell you because I didn't do it. We pulled it out of the web that has a lot of wonders, a lot of beauties. So you can see here the Unisa Flats, and let me just write this thing down. We have a video. We visited the South Flats, I believe 3 or 4 years ago, and we did a video on it. So if I have not listed that as part of your viewing, I will do that tonight. So as you can see in this picture here, you move to the right and you're looking at the South Flats, the whole immensity of it. And by the time you get to the right, you get to a car, and that's the car that's shown in the reduced aspect figure. So that's kind of interesting. There it is. Okay. Geology does not explain all the processes. We have other factors like atmospheric and ocean circulation. The circulation of the oceans, the circulation of the atmosphere, which sits on top of the ocean and the land, tectonism, the fact that the crust, the surface of the earth is a crust, but it sits on magma, hot stuff which volcanoes have a tendency to erupt whenever they erupt. Now, I did say at one time that at the beginning of the life of the earth, there was innumerable volcano eruptions. But over the last 4 billion years, it has come down to about 100. That's what the volcanologists say. 100 volcano eruptions every year, which is not a whole lot and not a whole little. But imagine if it were 1,000 or 10,000, we would be in much better shape. All that means is that the Earth has cooled over its time that it has been around. So 4.6 billion years. Continental location, also very important. Where are you and where is the continent and how big the continent is very important. Latitude, also latitude. If you're 0 latitude, it has a tendency to be hot. If you're latitude 60 degrees north or south, there's not that much light in there. So you have to think about that. And the form of the surface. The form of the surface is fundamental because we're studying hydrology. This course is hydrology, environmental hydrology. And the hydrology means that not only the rain, but also the water on the surface is going to run over the surface on what we call runoff. And how is it going to do that? It'll depend on the slope, and the slope will be determined by the geomorphology. So we say, and here's something very important. Geology is the first of a chain of related processes that condition and make possible life on Earth. Geomorphology may well be the second. They're kind of tied together. Like I said, geology is the rocks. Geomorphology is the form, the actual form of the surface. So we looked then at geomorphology, scientific study of landforms, and erosion and river transport is important for geomorphology. And I have a picture in here that I took when I did a project in northern Peru back in the year 2008 actually. This is called Rachichuela Creek. This is an interesting picture because it kind of shows that the form of the earth is determined by the movement, the erosion. But this is erosion, but it's interesting, but this is erosion of huge boulders and rocks, right, on this river. The question that I've always posed to myself is this hydraulics or hydrology? Actually, when you look at rivers, it's both. Hydrologists and geographers even study rivers, and also hydraulic engineers. We have to design the channels and so forth. So this is kind of in the midst or in the middle between hydraulics and hydrology. But look at the size of those boulders. But you move downstream on this river, and the final drop of this creek, it drops its water into the La Leche River, and you don't see these boulders. They're not there. So the question is, what happened? They disappear? And the answer is no, they just disaggregated, they disintegrated as they move downstream. So anytime we have a flood in here, the next time there's a flood, these boulders are going to move. So one day I posed the question, what are these boulders doing there? And the answer is resting. They are resting because next time there's a flood, they can move those boulders, and there are floods that can move boulders. I have seen in Mexico, I saw a boulder in the middle of a river, which we studied many years ago, that was about 15 feet diameter. Not 3, not 4, but 15 in the middle of the river. What was it doing there? It must have been sitting there for millions of years because it would be the flood of 1 million year return in order to move that huge rock. I've also seen it in other places. Large, huge, not even boulders, they're just chunks of rock that are in the middle of the river. You cannot see them in the downstream channels though, because the concavity, the profile has a tendency to be concave from above, the profile of the river. So the further you go downstream, geomorphologically speaking, the milder the slope. And if the slope is mild, it's not going to move these huge rocks. So these huge boulders and rocks would have to be upstream, close to the so-called headwaters. But in the case of this Mexican rock that I'm talking to you about, it was not the headwaters. It was someplace out there. It was actually in the uplands of the Ojos Negros Basin, which I've studied extensively over the years, more than 5 or 6 years that we studied that basin at the end of the year 1990s, 1999 to 2003. This one is an interesting graph that I pulled out of one of the government publications. I believe it was SCS, one of the SCS publications, or NRCS. This tells us that the delivery ratio is a function of the drainage area. The larger the drainage area, the less sediment is delivered, because the sediment has a tendency to stick around and stay and form the valleys. Without the sediment forming the valleys, we wouldn't have any soil. And if we didn't have any soil, we couldn't live here, because you can't extract nutrients out of rock. The only way to extract nutrients is for the rock to disintegrate or disaggregate, and then the microbes that pull the nutrients out can go, there are in the roots of the plants, can go in there and kind of harvest the nutrients that have been exposed by the disintegration. So we can, or nature cannot take a whole lot of nutrients out of whole rock. The rock needs to be disintegrated into soil, and therefore thank God that the erosion, disaggregation is there. And we can rely on the soils. Without soils, we couldn't survive on this planet, because we wouldn't have the elements to construct or to build on the food. Okay, so the shapes are fascinating, interesting, endless shapes. And I show in here an extreme of this one's called Spider Rock at Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. I have not been there, but I pulled this out of the web. Let's take a look at the display. That's a nice picture. That's a nice picture. This is in Arizona, and I also have one in Peru. This is called the Nuns in the rock forest of Wayai in Pasco in central Peru. The Wayai rock forest is very large. Is I believe the highest and largest rock forest in the world. I don't recall the exact size of it, but it's huge, and it has an infinite number of rock formations. You can't count them. As a matter of fact, you can't visit in there. You visit it, you go, you maybe take a look at 1 or 2%. You can't unless you spend months out there. And the reason is why. Maybe if you're interested in looking at that, but I do not believe tourists, like myself, I was a tourist. People that go out there and check it out, they spend over 2-3 hours, walking around the edge of the park, because it's too large to visit. But you can see all sorts of things in there like this one. The next subject is extremely important for us. ExoRage versus endorage drainages. There is a tenet of geomorphology. In geomorphology, interacts with the hydrology. And if there is a mouth of a particular basin, then we call it an ExoRage basin. The mouth of a certain basin or watershed drops its water into the next downstream basin, which eventually, after a succession of these situations, drops the water into the ocean. We call that ExoRage. Endorage is the opposite. There is no mouth. The mouth is this, technically there's a center of the drainage where everything collects. Why is that important? Because exorake basins drain their salt, and endorake don't. Endorake collect all the salt. It doesn't. There's no place for the salt to go. Why salt? Why is the salt out there? We had is that the curse of nature? And I often refer to that as not the curse, but certainly maybe a slight mistake with all due respect of nature, because salt is there and it kind of has a tendency to be not useful, and there's a whole lot of salt, much more than we would ever care to use. So it collects, and it collects as a byproduct of life, because life is based on the water. You have to have the water that rains and wets the soil and so forth. The water comes from the precipitation, but as it moves down the surface, and it has to move the surface before it gets anywhere, it collects the salts, which are right there. The salts are in the rocks, and in the rocks and in the soil. Once it collects the salts, then it goes and gets into the roots of the plants, and then it's finally absorbed by osmosis, and the plant actually takes the water and it circulates the water through its system, and then the water is evaporated on the leaves, but the salt doesn't go away. The salt doesn't go away. There's no way to remove the salt. So the only way to remove the salt in this situation is for it to rain again, or to artificially, you can go out there and apply water brought from some other place and wash, and we'll talk about this extensively later on. We're going to wash the soil so that it can be washed from the salts that have remained from the process of living, or the process of manufacturing food, growing crops. Growing crops will produce salt. Interesting thing, though, and we will look into this later on, is in what quantity the production, and the answer is it depends on the weather. That's why we're talking here ecohydroclimatology. If the weather is arid, a lot of salts will be produced. And if the weather is humid, very little salts. I remember when I was in India, I was sitting at about 800, 900 millimeters, 800 to 1,000. India is not a big country, but it has a lot of people, 1.4 billion. So it's about 5 times as many people from India than here in the United States. Let's say four and a half. And the area is probably about a fourth. So the density would be like 4 times 416. So just roughly speaking, don't take my number seriously, but there's a lot of density in India. We know that, and yet those people are managing to feed. They do manage to feed themselves, and they've been there for 8,000 years. Indian civilization is, you know, why? How can they do that? Because they have a system which relies entirely or extensively on the 800 to 1,000 millimeter isohyet, which I already told you that is the optimum answer, the optimum situation, because they have enough nutrients to support and don't have to deal with the salt. If they were in the 100 millimeter, they would have to deal with the salt, like the case of the Salton Sea. If they were in the 6,000 millimeter or even 3,000 millimeter, that's too much water. The salts were already all washed out a long time ago. So see, the good salts and the bad salts. So they don't have good salt that they can produce much. I think I already told you that staples like corn or potatoes cannot be grown in the Amazon. They just don't have the nutrients. Well, you can go out there and put the nutrients together and add the nutrients to the soil, but there's a problem. And the problem is that it'll rain that night, and the rain will carry those nutrients into the river, and eventually the river will be messed up in what we have referred to as eutrophication. It will be enriched artificially, and we will mess up the river. So typically people don't do that. The Brazilians are trying to do that, and eventually they're going to mess it up. So I hope they don't do it, but I'm not too confident. They do want to develop the Amazon. They say the Amazon can be developed. I don't think so because of its peculiar location in the climatic spectrum. At 3 to 4,000 millimeters, you can't do a whole lot of development. And the reason why I discuss this, I was in India and I was talking to those people, and I wanted to see what the problem, what solved problems did they have, and this was in the central part of India where the prevalence of the 800 to 1,000 millimeter, and they didn't. They told me they didn't have salts. They didn't have a very large problem with salts, which is interesting and confirms the point that I was just making. That doesn't mean that the Indians or the people from India don't have it. In Rajasthan to the west, they must have it because Rajasthan is dry. And in Assam to the east, they must have the opposite because Assam and the neighborhood of Assam is very, very wet. As a matter of fact, a place called Cherrapunji sits out there, and it has a precipitation which is recorded to be the highest in the world, 12,000 millimeters per year. That's 4 times the amount of the Amazon precipitation. Okay? And many times more, like 16 times the optimum that we have referred to as 800. But let me come back to the United States and we talk about the Great Basin. I'm going to try to speed up in here. Does the United States have endorheic basins? And the answer is yes, it has one big one, the Great Basin. Why is the Great Basin so big? Because the United States is big. The chances when this whole thing was done, maybe 500 million years ago or even longer than that, I can't tell you exactly the date or the time. If the continent is big, the chances is for it to have endorheic basins. Okay, Europe is not endorheic. It's not that big a continent, Europe. Asia does have endorheic basins though. China has the northwestern part of China is endorheic. They say they're going to develop it. I hope they don't do another Salton Sea. They should not, knowing well that we already made a mistake 100 years ago. But I am not sure. If they want to, and they can do it because now they got the money to develop the northwestern side of India for irrigation and production, agricultural productivity. And then what are they going to do with the dump stuff, the sewage, the agricultural sewage? It's a central location. It's just like the situation of the Salton Sea, with the difference that the Salton Sea is relatively close to the ocean, within 100 miles. Over there, you got to look at 1,000 miles before you can get to any ocean. So it's going to be a lot harder. We'll see what happens. I probably won't see it, but it'll happen in the next 50 to 100 years. So that's a Great Basin. Interestingly, the state of Nevada is almost entirely within the Great Basin. So Nevada is a state where you cannot do a whole lot of agriculture. So that is why Nevada uses the resources that it has. What resources does Nevada have? And the answer is the great Nevada resources that it was at the beginning, 100 years ago. It was close to California. California had a lot of people and continues to. People like to come to California. And at that time when this whole thing got started about 100 years ago, gambling was prohibited in California. But you can head out to Nevada and gamble in Nevada. So the gambling business became very big in Nevada because it originally attracted people from California. They'd like to go gambling and they couldn't do it in the States. Later on, of course, they became so great that now they attract everybody from not just California, the entire United States and around the world. But I submit that if it were not for gambling, the state of Nevada would be poor because they don't have a whole lot of agriculture. And there's other resources that are not agricultural production that we could count on with Nevada, by the way, but I'm not going to get in there because we're already getting too slow in here. So the salinity, the issue of salinity, very important from the standpoint of geomorphology because it's related. Here I have two pictures. One of them is the Great Salt Lake. That's a nice picture taken out of the web of the Great Salt Lake. I say in there At the Great Salt Lake, the salinity varies between 50 and 270 parts per thousand. So it is a little bit more than the ocean to very great amounts, about 8 times greater than the ocean, depending on where it is. Location, by comparison, the salinity of the ocean is about 35 parts per thousand. We know that. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum, let's take a look at the lakes that are very clean. And this one is interesting because this picture over here that you can see in there is from Lake Superior. And Lake Superior, which is it's kind of in the middle, smack middle of the United States, has a salinity of 0.063, which is the cleanest that I have seen, and I believe it's been referred to as the cleanest lake in the United States. Comparison, the salinity of typical fresh waters is 2, in other words, 2 to 3, 3 to 4 times as much fresh waters. So why is Lake Superior very clean? And the answer is because it drains places they're humid. Places out there in Manitoba, in places in the central Canada that are very clean, and I mean not clean, they're wet, they're humid, they're very humid because the latitude helps them out too, and so forth. So they're very humid. So a long time ago they already lost all their nutrients, or the salts are gone. So it's clean, very clean. So if you want to drink the freshest or the cleanest water, cleanest, not the freshest, the cleanest water, you can go to Lake Superior, and out there they do have the very clean water. What about other places of the world? Well, we have an example here of Lake Titicaca in Peru, which I've studied at one time. Lake Titicaca flushes about 2% of its volume on an annual basis. So you can figure out what the volume is, and you can figure out what the flush is in terms of discharge. And it turns out to be about 2%. This is where Lake Titicaca flushes out into this river, which is called the Saguadero, which in Spanish means get the water out, take the water out. And because of that, Lake Titicaca is about 1 ppt, which is 1,000 parts per million. So it's about 3 times the average. Not a whole lot, but not a whole little either. Remember, 1,000 parts per 35,000 is the ocean. 35 is the ocean. I'm talking about 1,000 or million. A bit of confusion in here. On the other hand, we can look at the Caspian Sea, which is in the lake. The Caspian Sea sits right next to Russia on the left, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. These are the ex-Soviet republics. Interesting thing about the Caspian Sea is that it is about, here it is, it has a salinity of 13 ppt, so it's about a third of the ocean. Remember, the ocean is 35. So the question is, what's going on here? How come it's so low? It should be high. But the reason why it is low is because it dumps all its sewage, its salt sewage, into this place in here, which is called by gravity, of course. It's called Garabogaskol Basin. So in here, I took this basin over here, looked it up on Google Earth. Okay, this is the image of the Garabogaskol Basin, and then there's the entrance over here. You can see in here, I'm playing around with my mouse. The entrance of the lake into the basin, and the salt basin, entrance over there. And where am I? Okay, and I've expanded for viewing it. This is where the salt enters into the salt lake, and turns out that salt lake has a salinity of 335 parts per thousand, which is extremely high, because at 360 it will become solid. As a matter of fact, Uyuni is 360. At that point, the concentration is such, the chemistry is such that it will precipitate. All the salt will precipitate. So 345 is very close to precipitation, and that's the reason why it doesn't look completely white like Uyuni. Uyuni looks completely white because it is 360. This one's 345, so it's not there yet. Climatology, climatic factors, proximity to the ocean. I'm sorry, the weather is determined by the proximity of a location to the sun. That's the first definition. So then we would assume that everything along the equator should be closest to the sun, and that is correct. But we're missing a point in here because the Earth is not flat. I already said it has some roughness, and in this case, we note that the Chimborazo volcano, which is in Ecuador, and Ecuador is called Ecuador because it's on the equator, close to the equator. It's on the equator, as a matter of fact. Ecuador is on the equator. There's a place out there in Ecuador, which I visited in the past a couple times when I've been there. I've been several times to Ecuador. Um, there's a place where they mark the zero latitude, north and south. Zero latitude north, zero latitude south. And it's kind of close to this place called Chimborazo. This is the peak of Chimborazo, which is referred to or reported to have the point closest to the sun. There it is. I didn't take this picture. I have pictures of the Chimborazo volcano. I was there, but they were not as good as this one, which I pulled out of the web. Okay, so as you can see, the weather determined by latitude and all sorts of other things in here. Atmospheric currents, okay, the El Nino southern oscillation. We referred to El Nino briefly. We talked extensively about El Nino in our hydrology class. So those of you that have or will be have taken last year or will be taking the hydrology class, my hydrology class next year, surface water hydrology, CIVE633, we will learn quite a lot about the El Nino. The continental location determines the weather, sure, because the coastal cities are the variations in temperature are attenuated by their proximity to the oceans. So east and west, we have nice weather. Nice weather here. This is not the weather that they have in North Dakota. And as a matter of fact, I have pointed that out by way of this chart in here. The average US is the green, and North Dakota has average high. So North Dakota, there's a variance in the temperature in North Dakota, as you can see. It's much colder. It's much colder and somewhat warmer too. So that's why there's not a whole lot of people in North Dakota. People like to shy away from the bad weather. I'm not sure what the population in North Dakota is, but I'm guessing that it could be maybe 1 or 2 million. We can guess that. We can look that up on the web, but it's not a whole lot. By comparison, California has 40 million people. Texas is about 25, I believe. Florida also has a lot of population. Orographic precipitation. This is what's going to happen. This is happening here in San Diego. We have the coastal California range, and it rains over here a lot. If we look at this, like here if we are located here on our location, this would be Lindbergh, where the precipitation is about 10 inches per year. Then you move up to Ramona, over here, it's about 15 inches per year. And then you move up to Mount Laguna, and that's 20 inches per year. And then you go over the mountains at, I believe, 4,500 feet. And they start coming down in here, and you get to Imperial Valley, and precipitation comes down to 2 inches per year. Yep, so that's why we call the rain shadow. The next subject is the volcano eruptions. The volcano eruptions, depending on their size, have a way of changing the weather locally for a while in space and time. Like the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in 1991. I was able to pull out this picture. This one doesn't expand. Changes, fires. Fires are very prevalent nowadays that we're talking about global warming or global climate change. This is a picture of the Shaki fire that I had a chance to look into in detail because at the time I was doing projects over in Tierra del Sol. Tierra del Sol is a neighborhood of Boulevard, which is one of the communities in San Diego, in southeastern San Diego County. I don't know, maybe you guys haven't been there, but there's Boulevard, and then there's Tierra del Sol. Tierra del Sol abuts with Mexico. So south of Tierra del Sol, you have the fence, the U.S.-Mexico fence. They had a fire, extensive fire, and I was there and had a chance to take these pictures. Burned 2,500 acres. Not the greatest, but big in that sense. I already shown these pictures. The rainforest, I'm sorry, and the Sahara. The rainforest and the Sahara. You can see the difference. The Sahara, it hardly rains, if ever. Some spots in the Sahara have never recorded precipitation. It's the I'm no, I'm sorry. This is not. Wait a second. I'm making a mistake in here. This is not the Sahara. I messed up. This is the location in Chile. Okay, where is the driest spot on Earth? The wettest part on Earth we already talked about. That is in Cherrapunji. But this is the difference. That's the difference that you see, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You probably have seen this in the movies or have actually been out there. I have been out there. Not in Cherrapunji. I was never able to get to Cherrapunji. I intended to go there, and I was almost on the plane to get there. Then I was thwarted by the politics. They wouldn't let me. That was 1993. They wouldn't let me go there because I didn't have the right permission. I was a foreigner, and they're very, very jealous of foreigners and stuff. So I couldn't get out there to observe Cherrapunji with my own eyes. But I've been to the Amazon. The Amazon is wet. It's very, very wet. And I've also been to the areas in coastal Peru, and some of them are as dry as the Sahara. Some areas of coastal Peru has never rained out there. So there's a comparison out there. Anthropogenic climate change is the newest factor in climatology that is produced by the so-called Arrhenius theory. Arrhenius in 1896 said that the carbon dioxide was loosely tied together in what has been referred to as a diatomic molecule, and it has a way to vibrate with the infrared radiation that's coming from the ground, because the sun hits the ground with short waves, but when it comes out, the heat comes out. It's got to go somewhere. The heat comes out, and it comes out at infrared, long waves, and the long waves hit the carbon dioxide, which is a constituent of the atmosphere, and it makes them vibrate, and by doing so, they actually do not let the heat go out. It's kind of resisting the heat going out because of the vibration and so forth. You imagine millions and millions and trillions of these molecules out there, and that's what's causing global warming. We, of course, didn't know that. Well, we knew. Arrhenius told us in 1896, even prior to the development of the assembly line. But of course, I'm sorry I said that, but in typical fashion, we really didn't pay attention to it. We didn't think it was that important at that time. Now, fast forward 120 years, and the leaders of the world are meeting to decide what to do. Unfortunately, not all of them are there. We know that from the news media. So it will take some time for the world to get together. We'd have to, sorry I said that, but we have to suffer a little bit more before people really realize what's going on. But Arrhenius told us in 1896. We can't say that, oh yeah, we just learned about it. Classification of climate. When we did our third sabbatical, I think it was third, no, our second sabbatical, we produced this chart in here because I had looked at all kinds of weather from very dry to very wet, and I was able to put this thing together. I had the contribution of a couple of scientists, hydrologists from India, who helped out researching the data. And I wasn't interested into doing some precision work. What I wanted to do is a conceptual model of how the weather works. And I call it in mid-latitudinal regions, because we are controlled only by the precipitation, mean annual precipitation. When you, in mid-latitudes, that happens. But if you go high latitudes, like in areas beyond 40 or 60 or even 60 degrees, then you have temperature come in as another factor where the weather has to take note of the temperature. We didn't want to get into the temperature, so we restricted this chart or this table to the mid-latitudinal regions. And as you can see, I have the mean annual precipitation varying from 100, 200, 400, 800, 1632, and 6400. Those are Kabbalistic numbers. 800 was the one I chose to put it in the fulcrum, the center. And the ratio between the mean annual to AGT, which is the terrestrial precipitation, AGT, I forget at this point, average terrestrial precipitation is like this. Let me see. Hold on a minute. Hold on a minute here. I'm just okay. Mean annual global terrestrial. Annual global terrestrial. So 800 over 800 is 1, then 2, 4, 8, and you go over here all the way to the right to Cherapunje and all the way to the left to the dry areas such as the Chilean desert out there, which is the driest area in the world, the Chilean desert, the desert in Chile. And then we had to do this classification, and there's several references for this. And I just looked this morning at a reference which actually says exactly what I said in here. Actually, it is a publication by an ecologist, a famed ecologist, which I'm going to talk about later, hopefully today. So super arid and hyper arid. Now, super and hyper mean the same thing. The only difference is that super is Nordic European, and hyper Southern European. Like hyper is Roman, Italian, Latin, while super comes from the Germans, the Northern Europeans, or the Anglo-English, German, kind of the same thing if you go back 1,500 years ago. And so we ordered it that way. They mean the same. We needed to find some words. And like I said, I did not invent this. It is in the literature, just like it. So we were able to look at the annual potential evapotranspiration, the values, which were documented from practice, and the length of the rainy season. In some places, it rains only a month or two, while in some per year. While in the super humid environment, it rains every night or every afternoon. Like the Amazon is well known for raining a lot. Now, this is a box that it is conceptual box, meaning it's not supposed to be perfect. It just kind of guides you through. But we believe that it is correct in the sense that it is conceptual. It's not perfect. It's like the Runoff curve number. The Runoff curve number is not supposed to be perfect. It's just supposed to guide you through the equation of the processes of the equation. Hydrology, the Atacama Desert, driest spot on Earth, and Cherapunje. The components of precipitation. And in here, we look at this equation, or look at this graph, average global components of precipitation. Evaporation, 58%. The runoff, 28%. Base flow, 12%. This is global average. But in reality, in some places, evaporation would be much more. The dark blue, would be much less. So it is our job as engineers, as hydrologists, to figure out how this pie is divided in every location that we study. But this one's the general one. Now, we note here deep percolation is at 2%. Deep percolation is what's being lost to the system. It goes to the deep groundwater and eventually makes it to the ocean, but we cannot control it. It's too deep for us to control it. So we typically forego this value over here. We kind of don't take it into consideration, thinking that it's too complex, too difficult to get a hold of. That's called a deep percolation. The oceans, the variations of the runoff, like in 2%. Arizona, mostly arid, stream flow is only 2% of precipitation. While in the Amazon, which is very wet, stream flow is 51%. Those are not the limits. There's places less than 2% and places more than 51%. Libovich, who did a study, showed that there was a place in the Philippines that he had measured at 93%. 93%. In other words, 100 units rain and 93 show off as runoff. That's huge. Look at the Amazon, which is already wet, it's only 51%. Okay, but we don't stop there. We looked at one place because the whole thing is interrelated. I want you to realize that there is no such a thing as a field in here. All the fields are connected, and that's my point in writing this paper. I was in many years ago. I did a study in Mexico, in the Papaloapan Basin, one of the largest rivers in Mexico. And I reviewed the data, and it turns out that this particular river out there, one of the thousands of rivers that they have, had a runoff coefficient of 1.19. 1.19? That means 100 units rain and 119 showed up. How do you explain, how do you justify that? More water was created. And the answer is underground rivers, karstic locations, karstic geology, underground caves. So, so that explained that very high value out there. So let's not be mistaken into thinking that all the water on the surface and that's it, because there's groundwater that's interacting with the groundwater on the surface and is giving out these numbers that may be hard to justify in any other way. So I do not believe that that was a mistake. It was correct. When I was I visited Cancun many years ago, and I traveled looking at the tourist attractions out there. And I was surprised to see that in that area of Mexico, you can travel 100 miles and you don't see one river. Because I was looking for the rivers. I like to take pictures of rivers. I built up my site based on that, taking pictures, taking good pictures of rivers. I couldn't see any rivers, and I figured, what the heck's going on here? Where are the rivers? Did I miss them? You can't. If you go on the road, you have to hit them. You have to hit the rivers every once in a while. Why are there no rivers in that part of the world? And the answer is because they're all underground. Those are the famous cenotes. You may have heard of it. Look it up, Cenote. You'll see all kinds of stuff out there on the web. The web is good as far as that's concerned, showing the cenotes, the underground rivers of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Event versus yield hydrology. That's an important one for us. Well, here we go. These two pictures of Itapicuru River in Brazil, documented by Livovich, who was a Russian gentleman who did a very good study in the year 1979 on the water resources of the earth or the world. This is a very dry river with a very low runoff coefficient. And this one's the Cayagan River in the Philippines, that has a runoff coefficient of 93%. Livovich said that the reason why this coefficient is high is because it has a lot of rock out there. It's very rocky terrain. It's a very small basin, rocky terrain. So the water's not going, and the rocks must not be fractured, because when you have fractured rock, the water seeps into the ground and it gets lost. But this must be a local situation where there's no earthquakes, no fractures, relatively recent, not quaternary geology, or God knows, I have not been there. All I'm telling you is that I report what Livovich said, and Livovich is a very, very reputable source. 93%, the Cayagan River at Pandan, the Philippines. I've not been out there. I would love to go out there. I probably think I'm not going to make it. Okay, there's two things that we need to discover or to examine here. There's the C coefficient, explicit with the rational method, Q equals CIA, which is the runoff coefficient. But that is an event coefficient. That has to be distinguished. That varies with the percent imperviousness. The C varies with the percent imperviousness. The greater the percent imperviousness, then the C is, okay, over here. The C is more, actually, goes over here like this. It's more. So this is the C. But that has nothing to do with the yield runoff coefficient per year, not per event. And the yield runoff coefficient typically looks like this. And the yield runoff coefficient depends on the ratio between the mean average to global terrestrial. So when it's 800, it's like this. It is, if it's 3,200, it's like that. It gets higher and higher, like the Amazon. So we've been able to plot this figure because we know the answers. And like I said, this is also conceptual. It's in the ballpark. It's like the Kerr number. I interviewed Marcus. I know what I'm talking. Okay, he said it was conceptual. He He was not intending to solve everybody's problems. He was just referentially speaking of what could happen in the mean. Back in the year 1993, somebody wrote a book and they said that the current number was wrong because they didn't fit that particular piece of data. So I talked to Marcus about it, and he said, "You know what? Those guys don't know what they're talking. I never intended for my method to fit every data." That's what he said, and he was correct. The same thing we say in here. We do not intend for our curves to fit every data. It's just local, general behavior in the mean. Management of groundwater. Groundwater is always there. But we know from studies that have been done that surface water recycles every 11 days, while surface water takes 1,500 years. So in other words, if surface water is exhausted, you just sit around and wait for 11 days and the reservoirs will fill up. Well, 11 days on the average, world average. It may take 30 days, but what the heck, you can wait. We can wait 30 days. But the groundwater is not like that. The groundwater, if it's exhausted, it will take, on the average, around the world, 1,500 years. It may take 100 years, which is still long, or it may take 10,000, but on the average, it's about 1,500. That has been studied. So we cannot afford, in general, based on sustained concepts of sustainability, that we can exhaust or drop or abate our groundwaters, because then we're going to run out of water. We're going to run out of water. Unfortunately, people around the world are doing this just because. I mean, there's politics, there's economics, and so forth. Okay, the California is pumping about 45% of its water from the ground, which is a lot. I would have expected to be less than 20% for us to be comfortably happy, but we're not. Arizona also, well, there's a lot of states in the United States as well, countries around the world are pumping their groundwater. They're eventually going to have to pay for it. It will take some time. It will not be tomorrow. It may be 1 or 2 generations, but they'll have to pay for it. You cannot, sustainability will have to be faced. We need to face sustainability, and you guys know what I'm talking about. This is everywhere. It's in the papers and so forth. So the issue of salinity is very important. Societies that deplete groundwater are bound to become unsustainable. Sooner or later, they will have to come to grips with the fact that groundwater is not readily recyclable. If we take the tapping groundwater for the purpose of developing unclaimed resources may not be the answer. Salinity content of groundwater is bound to increase with depth. That's what Chebotarev said in 1955. In peripheral continental regions, brine lines may be built, right? You can build a brine line like this one. This is Callehuas Salinity Management Pipeline in Ventura County. In Ventura, here, north of here, about 3 hours from here. Under construction in 2007. I was there and I was lucky to take this picture of the pipe under construction. I asked the gentleman that was there helping out, I said, how come they're big? And he says, because we don't intend to know another line like this in 100 years. We're going to put all our salinity, all our salt brines out here into the ocean. This pipe, at the time they built it, I think it was 60 miles, and it cost $60 million. That was in the year 2007. Now I bet it will be at least double, if not more. Everything has doubled, But it is one way to get rid of the salt once you pump it out. What these people are doing is very simple. They're pumping salt from 1,000, no more 1,000, 2,000 feet, and it's coming out saline. So then they process it through the reverse osmosis plants, and they pull out 70%, which is the potable water, and they've got to deal with the brine. And the brine, they connect all the channels and put it into this huge pipe, and they send it to the ocean. And they have an outfall out there. It's about a 1 mile outfall. I'm wondering how they were allowed to have this 1 mile. I was not involved. I just looked at it from afar. I took pictures. But there's studies should be done that show that the drop of this brine 1 mile off the ocean was okay out there in, I think it was Port Hueneme. You guys may not know the geography, but Port Hueneme is a little bit south of, somewhat south of Santa Barbara. Port Hueneme is, I believe, where the Civil Engineering Army, or the Navy Civil Engineering Corps, I believe, is at Port Hueneme, where where this bright line drops into the ocean. Ecology, science that deals with interactions between organisms. So when we bring in ecology, ecology is one of the subjects of biology. But that's wrong, in my opinion, because ecology covers everything, covers physics, chemistry, biology. So if you're a good biologist, you cannot do good ecology because ecology has also physics and chemistry, and you're not a physicist or a chemist, unfortunately, right? I remember when I was in Brazil back in 1993, I was invited to give a lecture over at the University of Mato Grosso, one of the universities out there in the Pantanal. And the reason why, they told me, I was invited by the Department of Biology, and I'm a civil engineer, and they knew that. But they also knew that I was a hydrologist, and they wanted to know more about water because they felt at the time that they were missing on this important component, which is the water, the humidity, the moisture. They knew the plants, they knew the botany, they knew everything in their fields, ecology field, but they were missing because ecology is a combination of all the natural sciences. And the three that generally stand are physics, chemistry, and biology, which is kind of interesting because we, 200 years ago, in our wisdom, divided science, natural science, into physics, chemistry, and biology. Out came Newton and developed the physics, the chemistry. I believe it was a couple of French people, Lavoisier and others. And then biology, Humboldt was not quite, but Humboldt was instrumental in the development of botany, which is part of biology's kind of thing. And that was 200 years ago. And then since then, we've been specializing to the hill. And only recently, over the last 30 years, have we realized that we have to go back a little bit because we overdid it. We became too much of a specialist, and therefore we don't understand any other field. So ecology is a field that is mixed. I had to get into it because being a civil engineer, I was doing environmental studies, and the environmental studies cover everything. So if I didn't know it, then I had to learn it. Otherwise, they weren't going to give me a job. Right. And I should tell you a story about that. Interesting story. I did the hydrology of La Leche River in Peru back in the year 2007. I was hired to do the hydrologist. They knew I was a hydrologist and so forth. So it took me a year to do that work, and I presented a very nice report, very well done, long, detailed report. And I believe we have already talked about that in this class. And then right after I finished, and I got called by the boss, the guy that hired me, and he said, Ponce, are you interested in doing the environmental impact? And I said, sure, I got a few, 3 or 4 projects that I've done. I can do it. And he says, I'm going to give it to you. I said, well, thanks. And then he proceeded to add, said, you write such good reports and they're so nice that I want my environmental impact written by you. I said, thank you. Okay. So I basically, because I was able to show that I could put it on the web, that I can put it with all kinds of colors and stuff, I got that second job, which forced me to learn even more ecology. Because you know what? Ecology is 100 times more difficult than chemistry and biology put together. Because ecology contains the biology, and the biology, we don't really know too much about it. Besides, there's millions of species. Formulas of physics, maybe 100, 200, 300, maybe. But chemistry, the relationships of biology are immense. Nobody really knows how many species are out there. The number 10 million comes to mind. 10 million species, vegetative species. Who's going to study 10 million species? Nobody. It's too much, too difficult. Okay. I think Humboldt said in one of his books that they have told him, and he thought that biology and ecology were the most difficult science because they were too complex, and that is fact. That is a fact. So I went out there and hired a consultant, a renowned local ecologist, and he basically taught me everything I know. That's the way it happened, and then we documented in the report. So we have some pictures in here to show. We were in a place which varies a whole lot. It varies even with the aspect. What does that mean? The aspect means you have a hill. On one side, you have one type of vegetation. On the other side, you have another. Because since it's in the latitude, it depends on this exposure to the sun, right? So there's one side that gets exposure and another side that gets the shadow or the shade. And it doesn't get as much, and it's a totally different geological location. I'm sorry, ecological location. So we looked at that types of ecosystems, aquatic, transitional, terrestrial, and we learned from this also. And by working on the Pantanal of Mato Grosso, I actually began my study of ecology back in the year 79. That's 42 years ago. I had to. I had to because otherwise I wasn't going to do the job. So as you can see, engineering is fine and good, but sometimes you're forced to get into some other fields because of the location and the local situation. So we have in here a picture that I personally took. I went to Patagonia. I was called upon to go out there and took this picture of the Santa Cruz River where Darwin was out here when he went from England in the year 1831. He went and hit this location over here, the Santa Cruz River, and he talked about it in his writings. Succession, ecological succession, landslides, uh, climax vegetation, all these are concepts that need to be studied and understood. Ecohydrology, water and vegetation, which comes first? And here I want you to read this stuff. I want you to read this entire report because it'll be on the exam. If you have a potted plant, that was not put in there by nature. So you have to water it because the potted plant is inside the house, and if you don't put it in the water, it'll dry out and die, right? But if the plant were outside, it would be watered. And depending on the weather, some plants don't require a lot of water, some plants do require water. It depends on the weather. Actually, nature fits itself nicely because depending on how much it rains, just to talk about just water availability, the the ecology would be a type that will adjust itself. It will survive. That's why grass doesn't survive in the Western United States. So if you put together a golf course, it's against nature. A golf course in the Western United States, Eastern okay, but not Western. So the so many golf courses that we have out here, they're basically unsustainable. They aren't sustainable. We had a study on this done in the year 2013, by the way, on the unsustainability of golf courses because the grass is not a plant that would grow in here. It's just fascinating and interesting. So water vegetation, which comes first? None of them. They're cybernetic. One calls the other, and the other calls the one. And that we have explained in here. Types of processes for cooling of air masses. The first three are well known: rising and cooling. Here, lifting and cooling. Here, jumping over a hill like we have here in San Diego and cooling. What is not very well known in most books is this one, thermal lifting, the rising of the heat when the albedo is low. In this case, we have a rainforest. The albedo is low, 7% usually, and therefore it has a tendency to warm the lower atmosphere and produce rain. And that is the reason why, there's the reason why I'm lost in here. Here, I think. No? I'm lost. Oh, there it is. There's the reason why it rains every afternoon in the Amazon, because of this thermal lifting. This concept is not very well known, by the way. I dug it out. If you look at all the books only talk about the three. My book does talk about the fourth one because I read. But there's articles written on the very difficult to get publications of ARS and the Soil Conservation Service on the subject of thermal lifting. Those are the four places, the four ways that rain can be produced. Now, albedo, what is albedo? Albedo is the reflectivity, the coefficient of reflectivity. It can be low for water or rainforest, or it can be high for snow. It can be middle, like for deserts, 50% or so. As you can say in here, I pull out this from Wikimedia, where we just gave you some color in here, where we have different types of different values for the albedo. Albedo is a very important concept because it can be modified, manipulated by human beings. You can increase the albedo, thereby leading to desertification, or you can decrease the albedo, the opposite, leading to humidification. Now, for one instance of humidification, there's probably 50 instances of desertification because the human being or the human species is typically or technically a desertifying entity or species. We produce this desertification. For us, it's extremely hard to humidify the weather. We have a tendency to desertify it. And that's why desertification is prevalent or established around the world. We go in there. How does that happen? Well, very simple. When you take a tree down, you convert it into range, and you already begin the process of desertification because there will be less rain in the range. Then we convert the range into agriculture, even less rain. And then we convert the agriculture into urban and no rain whatsoever. Because, like I said, the process is cybernetic. We have had a hard time understanding the issue of cybernetic processes because they are biological. Most of our training is in physics and maybe in chemistry, but those are not cybernetic. The cybernetic comes from life. Life is cybernetic. Life has the property of self-sustaining and persevering, while other situations in physics you can go up and down, J-curve type of stuff, but not a cybernetic intrinsic mechanism. So we need to understand the issue that nature is cybernetic, and therefore it's not XY. Cybernetics is entirely opposite to the Cartesian mindset, I say in there, confounding the physical scientist accustomed to the Cartesian mindset of X always being X and Y always being Y. With Cartesian mindset, we would get to the moon because it was all physics and chemistry maybe. But we can't solve a lot of the problems in the Earth because we have not completely understood the issue of cybernetic functioning of ecology and biology. Groundwater, the role of groundwater, very important. Mainzer in 1927, we'll take a look at this this Thursday. He talked about this extensively, so I'm going to get there eventually. The role of geomorphology. Geomorphology cuts into the terrain and determines what plants are there. And many good authors like GSGS Water Supply Paper 577, where I pulled this out from, explains this. If you're observant, you can actually, where is it now? I lost it again. You can actually, if you look at the plans, you can determine the depth of the groundwater. How fascinating. That's what Mainzer said for the first time in 1927. He basically said, if you want to look at the hydrology, if you want to understand the underground hydrology, just look at the plants, because the plants is a picture of what's going on down there. And he was 100% correct. But and I believe he was a civil engineer, 1927, Mainzer. And since then, of course, we have been looking into this, and we now know that as hydrologists, we need to understand ecology. How beautiful statement, because it is. Because otherwise, you cut yourself short. If you don't want to look at the plants, then you're cutting yourself short, particularly in the relationship between surface water and groundwater. And since groundwater converts into surface water all the time by virtue of the base flow, then we cannot compartmentalize. We cannot say, I'm not going to look at the groundwater. I'm just a surface water guy. No, surface water and groundwater are together. As a matter of fact, we had a problem like that 30 years ago, when you had the surface water hydrologists and the groundwater hydrologists. They wouldn't talk to each other. And I have personally suffered because of that, by the way. I think I already told you that one day I wrote a paper in the midst of it, in the middle of it, between one and the other. You cannot tell whether it was surface or groundwater because it was in the middle. And the paper was not accepted for publication because the reviewers didn't understand what I was talking. That's a truth. That's a fact. Okay, for instance, this vegetational gradient, there's a very important picture in here, which I took, a picture that I took in Mato Grosso. This is what we call the riparian forest, the gallery forest. Very wet, dark green. Then you have over there, very dry, the cerrado, which cerrado means close, okay, close vegetation, and in the middle you have the grasses. How fascinating. So what's the difference? And this, by the way, this geomorphological, how can I say, transect repeats itself throughout this area of Mato Grosso in Brazil. And the answer to this puzzle, if you could call it a puzzle, is that here you have wet, and here you have dry, and here fluctuating in the middle. It could be wet or it could be dry, so that you get the grasses in there. The grasses can survive the fluctuating uh, situation, while the cerrado cannot. The cerrado wants dry, and these dark trees, they want wet. You can see how things are. So we have a bunch of pictures out here that we took from various places. Hydroclimatology, I'm not going to get in there because I've already gotten in there, and it's very extensive and detailed, but I do want you to read it in case you did not take surface water hydrology, because in surface water hydrology, we already talked about this. We already talked. So this part of hydroclimatology, I'm not going to stress with you. Neither bioclimatology, although I do want to mention the Holdridge life zones, display the Holdridge life zones. I was looking at it this morning, and I looked at this before, by the way. But look at this, super arid, per arid, arid, semi-arid. He's talking about the same divisions. And as a matter of fact, very close to what I have done. Very close to what I have done. The only difference is that he is starting 125. I started 100. Typically, the geographers always start at 125 so they can get it at 1,000. Can you see that? 125, 255. I started at 100 because I didn't want to get to 1,000. I thought 1,000 was not a number that I could physically relate to. I thought 800 was the number. So I rewrote this thing from 100, 200, 400, 800, 1,600. So I'm a little bit off with regards to Holdridge graph, which is referred to in ecology as the life zones. The life zones of Holdridge. If you study ecology, you will get in here. You will get into this. So suffice it to say that I do believe that our treatment of these subjects kind of closely match, not exactly, the graph, this is a famous graph, Holdridge life zones in ecology and various other types. So by looking at the plans, and I later on in my career became a student of plants. Can you believe that? Because I do believe now that if you look at the plants and you understand the plants, then you know more hydrology than you think. Really, a lot. So therefore, we gain a lot of respect for the plants, which we didn't have at the beginning, by the way. Civil engineers, what do you know about plants? Nothing, right? And I think I populated in your video list a story, a good story that happened to me at one time. I had a meeting with a whole bunch of interdisciplinary people, and just watch the video and you'll see what happens. Okay, so we finally get in there. Ecohydroclimatology, that's where we're driving for. We want to combine ecology, concepts of ecology, with hydrology and with climatology. We believe they cannot be separated, simply put. Now, this is taking off, but it will take some time before these things are realized and understood. I do want to station here the very important graph, which is called a cycle of metamorphism of groundwater quality. This is a graph that was developed by Chebotarev, right? Chebotarev. Chebotarev was a Russian gentleman who was working out of Australia, and he measured, I believe, I read the papers, there's 3 papers. He measured 800 wells around the world, 800. And he was able to, wells of different sizes, different depths, and different salinities also. So he was able to construct this chart in here. The hydrodynamic zones, stagnant conditions, active exchange, delayed exchange, bicarbonate waters. He basically said that on the surface you got the bicarbonate waters. Below the surface you have the sulfate waters. And then deep you get the chloride waters. And that has a lot to do with the chemistry. The chemistry is very important here. The chloride waters are deep because they, once formed or once developed, they have a hard time disappearing. They cannot be precipitated. It's extremely hard to precipitate chloride out of water because it has a high degree of solubility, perhaps the highest. Okay, so once chloride, sodium chloride in particular, gets in there, it just has a tendency to stay there. So the salinity in percent, look at this, 0.2, 1, 3, 0.25, 0.7, no, 3.8. There's a gap in there or at overlap. They get to 3, this starts at 0, it gets to 1.9, and this one gets to 35, which is the largest. 35.7 is the largest. So in here you have a whole lot of salt in here, but it's deep. So conclusion of this chart is the deeper you go, the more saline and the more sodium chloride you're getting out. So we got to be careful. I would rather not touch it, but I am not the politicians or the people that make decisions, the economic people, because if you bring that salt to the ground, then what are you going to do with it? You have to throw it away. It would be a sin to actually put it aside or hide it somewhere, because then you're ruining yourself for the future. Not yourself. People retire and die. It's the generations that come, the ones that are going to pay for it. Okay? So the case for geomorphology. This is very fascinating. I'm going to finish it here in a couple minutes. I'm almost there. This is a riparian corridor of coast live oak. This is a river, but it's really doesn't have a lot of water. The fact that it doesn't have water doesn't mean that it doesn't have moisture. The moisture is there, and it is able to support this community of coast live oak on the sides, right? And likewise, this is the largest tree, I believe, in California, although I don't have data to support that, but it is a huge tree. We measured it back in the year 2013. That's Alex Gostomelsky, one of our students at the time, and it measures 7.5-meter circumference, about 2.5-meter diameter. So you can see that it's a very large river. We were also able to document a few of these, but smaller, on the other side of the border. Because it's the same ecology. I mean, the fact that we have a straight line in there dividing Mexico and the US doesn't mean anything for nature. So there's trees like that, although smaller, one that is about half the size, also coast live oak, in Mexico, in northern Mexico, in the area, okay, as you cross the border. And so how are these trees out there in this desert? Because this is a desert. How are they? Aha, that is a key that we studied. It's a desert, but it has groundwater, like Mainzer said. If you want to look at the condition of the surface, go and take a look at the groundwater. This actually has a flow of groundwater, sustained forever. This tree is supposed to have an age of about 300 years, although I don't really know exactly. It could be 300, 400, God, who knows, okay? So we were able to say at this time when we did the study in the year 2013, that they shouldn't pump the groundwater in the neighborhood because it's going to affect and probably even kill this tree. And that would be major disaster. I'm not sure whether they did it or not. They intended to pump the groundwater in the neighborhood. It is unfortunate. Those people that make decisions don't go to school. They don't go to master's degree like you guys, and therefore make the wrong decisions. And finally, the case studies. I'm not going to get into the case studies because I did run out of time. If I have some time, maybe Thursday when I come back at the end of the class, I will get to the case studies. So with that, I finish in here. I've given you a brief overview, I guess I can say fast overview, of all these subjects that are all related. So all we need to do is understand the concept of interdisciplinary science, which is what we're trying to do here. The mix of the combination of ecology, which is plants, and ecosystems, ecology and hydrology, the water, surface, groundwater. There's a new water kit, by the way, out there. That I call the horizontal precipitation. What is horizontal precipitation? It's the precipitation that comes from condensation of high humidity locales. I was in Ecuador when I learned about this. It's fascinating. There was this place out there that rained 3,000 millimeters, which is a whole lot. But it had more vegetation that you could justify with 3,000 millimeters. So people were wondering what the heck's going on in here. It looks like we got 6,000. So then the Germans came in, a university in Germany came over and established for 10 years a scientific station in order to study what the heck was going on in that particular locale. And they figured out that there was a whole lot of moisture in the air. It's called cloud forest. It's a cloud forest, actually. The name is cloud forest. And the cloud forest was causing a lot of precipitation. They actually measured the horizontal precipitation as opposed to vertical. In other words, the horizontal precipitation is the one that's stored or hidden in the clouds, in the cloud forest, and then it hits the ground in the morning, the dew point, and so forth, and then it collects in the stems, right, and then it drains into the root, right.